Hi everyone, pleasure to be meeting you all here virtually. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whichever part of the world you're joining in from. Thank you for being here, and I'm excited to present my work. And I would greatly appreciate your thoughts, feedback, and suggestions. So with that, I will get started and I will share my screen. So the title of the work that I'm presenting today is Male Migration and the Emergence of Female Farm Management in India. To give you a bit of background, migration is a globally prevalent phenomenon, and we hear of millions of people migrating every year in search of better jobs, better incomes, and better livelihoods. While we tend to hear more about international migration, internal migration is also a significant phenomenon in many developing countries, particularly India and China. India is where this research is situated, and migration is also widely prevalent in India. And as per data from Census 2011, India had over 450 million internal migrants in the country. Now, a couple of key features about India's migration scenario is that it is heavily male dominant, and then rural out migration is the top migration streams, the largest migration stream in the country. Now, in this context, my research is focused on understanding the effects of this migration on the households that send out these migrants. And why is this important? It is important because migration can have a wide range of consequences or implications for the households that send out these migrants. And this paper touches on changes in a couple of themes. Now, to give you a sense of how these changes could be, if you look at agriculture, if a farming household sends out a migrant, then it immediately has a reduction in the labor that it can use to employ on the farms, which means that it has to find ways to substitute for this lost labor. So the remaining members may step up and increase their contributions, or the household may hire additional labor. Or if the migrant sends back remittances, it could invest these remittances in purchasing capital inputs like farming tools and machinery for the farms, and so on. So inputs can change, cropping patterns can change, where the household moves away from labor-intensive crops, or the household could even move out of agriculture altogether. And these various scenarios have been explored in the literature in the context of different countries. Another element is that if a particular member was making decisions on the farm and this member now migrates, now there is going to be a change in who is making the decisions, and therefore a change in the nature of decisions taken, which could in turn affect agricultural outcomes. So agriculture is one important domain which sees a lot of changes when the household experiences migration. Another element of interest is how male migration can change intra-household gender relations. And when the men leave and the women are left behind, how does it change intra-household gender relations? And this question is even more pertinent and important in the context of a country like India, which experiences male-dominant migration and is also a patriarchal society. So this research touches on both these themes, where I look at what happens to women in agriculture following male migration. So I ask two questions in my research. And the first question is, how does male migration change women's participation in agriculture in terms of their work and decision making? And a quick review of the result is that women are significantly more likely to become farm decision makers. Now, why is this an important result? Now, in the Indian context, a lot has been spoken about women in agriculture, the quantum of women as labor in agriculture. There are reports which say that there are more women in agriculture than men, and this number is growing over time. And there are other studies which have looked into the effects of changes in women's labor following male migration. But in more recent times, the literature is also beginning to take notice of this women's foray into decision-making in agriculture. And this is novel and important because oftentimes these women lack the experience or the exposure to managing a farm, and they're often pushed into this new responsibility when the men migrate. And when they lack the experience and skill, it may have adverse consequences for agriculture. And in many developing societies, the women also have unequal access to inputs like land and credit. They may face discrimination in being able to source technical know-how or other inputs, and all of this may hinder their abilities to make decisions on the farm effectively. So, in that context, where the literature is now beginning to take note of something called managerial feminization, or women becoming farm managers or decision makers, this result is novel in the Indian scene by finding that male migration is one of the drivers of women becoming decision makers. Now, let me walk you through the data and methodology. I use data from the Indian Human Development Survey, which is a multi-topic, two-round household panel survey with data in 2005 and 2012. So this is about the general data set. The particular sample that I use is I look at a balanced sample, and I focus on the households in rural areas which are engaged in cultivation in both rounds. And my final sample has about 10,000 households, and I divide this into two groups. One group which does not experience any migration in both the baseline and the end line, and I call that the non-migrant households or the control group. The other group which does not have any migrants in the baseline but experiences male migration between the two rounds, and I call this the migrant households or the treatment group. And about 15% of the households in my sample fall into this group, where they experience male migration between the two groups. So to give you an overview of the outcomes that I've used, I look at a broader suite of outcomes in the paper, but for the purposes of this talk, I would like to draw your attention to two key outcomes to measure both women's labor and women's decision making. So to measure farm labor, I look at the share of female labor in total family farm labor. And to measure decision making, I use a binary variable, which indicates if the household has a female decision maker or a female farm manager versus a male farm manager. And the IHDS dataset is novel in this sense because it captures this information at a national scale. And yes, of course, decision making has much more depth and dimensions to it rather than just a simple binary variable. But nevertheless, this is the first data set to measure this or capture this information, and I use that variable to measure women's participation in decision making. Now, to describe the methodology I use a difference in difference framework, which, and what I do in this framework is I have two sets of households, non-migrant and migrant. And I take and I have two data points for each of these groups. I take the difference over time in the outcome for each group, and then I take a difference between these two groups, and that is difference in differences. And I make the parallel trends assumption, which states that when you have these treatment and control groups, the parallel trends assumption assumes that the pre-treatment differences between these two groups is going to be constant over time, and any change other than the treatment is going to affect the two groups in a similar way. And that's how you arrive at parallel trends. So after accounting for these differences, any other difference that persists in the end line is attributable to the treatment effect. Now, is it fair to assume or say that these two groups of households are similar in the baseline to start with? That is not the case because migration is an endogenous phenomenon that is subject to self-selection, and the households could choose to migrate based on various observable and unobservable characteristics, and it is important to account for this endogeneity. And to do that, I use propensity score matching methods, where I match migrant and non-migrant households based on their pre-treatment characteristics. And I say that conditional on these observed characteristics. Once I account for all of these observed characteristics, then the households are now matched in the baseline. The treatment and the control households are similar and matched in the baseline. And then I apply the difference in difference framework on this matched sample. So my final empirical framework is where I have the DID framework written in terms of changes in outcomes. And this DID model is applied on the matched sample where the treatment and control households are similar in the baseline. And so I measured the change in the outcome between baseline and inline. And then beta M here, the coefficient in bold, gives me the treatment effect. I also account for a few household level characteristics. And following practice in literature, I include district fixed effects and I cluster errors at the district level. Now on to the results. In terms of change in female labor, I find about a 4 percentage point increase in female labor on the farm, which is significant but fairly small in magnitude. On the other hand, the novel and important result here is the increase in women's participation in decision making by about 13 percentage points. And this roughly translates to almost a tripling in the share of women who report becoming decision makers on the farm. And now, in the context that I outlined earlier, where women could face challenges in managing the farm, this result that migration is driving women in this role is an important result to bear in mind. And I find that this result, so the results in this table are presented for the kernel matching algorithm. They are robust to various other matching algorithms. And I also wanted to present a brief snippet of heterogeneous results based on regional groups as well as groups by family structure. So if you focus on the left side of the panel here, what I want you to take away from this graph is that the increase in female farm management is much higher in northern states rather than southern states. And this is to be expected because migration is much higher in the northern states than the south. But the other point to note here is that several studies record that the northern states have more stricter and stringent gender and social norms. So it may be a bit more of a challenging atmosphere for women to become farm managers in. The right side of the panel depicts the heterogeneous findings by nuclear and joint families. And I find that female farm management is much higher in nuclear families. And this is again in line with other findings from other studies, because in joint families, it's usually the other elderly men who take up decision-making roles. So I just wanted to present a few findings, and these also hold value in a very diverse country such as India. Now, there's a lot of talk about female farm management and what are their characteristics and what do I see in the data. Relative to male farm managers, women have lower education, own smaller lands, have lesser access to credit, and are less likely to own farming tools. So this is in line with the conditions that I described earlier in the beginning of the talk. And now, given these attributes, I'm naturally drawn to asking the question, well, if migration can affect agriculture in myriad ways, say migration can affect farm profits, and if migration is also resulting in women taking on these roles, which in turn can affect farm profits, is this an important pathway? Is female farm management an important channel through which migration affects farm profits? And that's the second question I ask. Does female farm management play a significant mediating role in influencing migration's overall effect on farm profits? Yes, migration suppresses farm profits, and about a third of this decline comes from female farm management. And of course, this is conditional on the assumptions involved in the method that I used to arrive at this answer. So I find this by using a causal mediation analysis, which helps me decompose the total effects into an indirect effect through female farm management and direct effect through all other channels. I adopt Ima et al.'s framework, and I use the cross-sectional data for this analysis. So there are two important assumptions to bear in mind. The treatment needs to be exogenous, which I ensure by matching the sample on pre-treatment characteristics. The second is that the mediator should also be as good as random, given the treatment and other baseline covariates. And that is a strict assumption which is difficult to be satisfied even in experimental settings. So that is a caveat to bear in mind. But the advantage of using this framework is that they provide a sensitivity analysis to check if the results are sensitive to a violation of these assumptions, and I also undertake that test. So now, given this setup where we have the treatment, mediator, and the outcome, I go ahead and estimate the models that are listed I follow the sequence of steps in MI et al. And I estimate the different coefficients associated with the treatment mediator and the outcome. But the final takeaway from this analysis is the box in the bottom of the screen, where I find an indirect effect and a direct effect and a total effect. The total effect is just the sum of the indirect and direct effects. And the proportion of indirect effect and the total effect is the proportion that is mediated. So what this tells us is that there is a decline in farm profits after male migration. And there is an indirect channel through female farm management that accounts for about 31% of this decline. And the rest of it comes from all other direct channels through migration. Now, a couple of important things to remember here is that the assumptions are very, the findings are sensitive to the assumptions. The second caveat is that farm profits may not be the best variable to capture this information, capture this change or the pathway, but that is the only variable we have access to, because farm profits can change when prices change, when crop mix changes, and it's hard to unwrap and understand where exactly the decline in farm profits is coming from. But nevertheless, this exercise is a useful exploratory analysis to think about think about a way in which we can start exploring the causal pathways through which important relationships are becoming evident in the data set. So, and that's my intention behind doing this mediation analysis. Now, so to sum up, women's roles are significantly changing, and female farm management mediates about a third of the decline in farm profits, conditional on the assumptions and the limitations involved. Now, I would like to take this research forward by digging deeper into understanding the different aspects of farm labor and decision making that change as a result when men migrate. So, let me conclude here, and I would welcome your thoughts and suggestions. So, thank you for staying with me until here. Look forward to speaking with you after the talk.